Jai Hind, Namaste, hello and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav and in this video we'll be discussing The Hindu and Indian Express for the date 22nd of October 2020. Now the PDFs for this video are available on the Telegram channel. I'm sorry I have not been uploading for the past 2 days. From today I'll be very regular with that. And for your convenience, I have also added timestamps in the description. So if you want to skip to a particular news, just use those timestamps. And if you like our videos, please do subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we post. And also, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. So without wasting your time, let's get started. So starting with the Hindu, page 1, ICMR nod for low-cost COVID-19 testing kit. COVID RAP showed accuracy levels similar to RT-PCR method. If you remember, yesterday we discussed the Feluda kit, right? So today we will be discussing this kit, and this topic is important for your paper 3 science and tech and indigenization of technology. It uses nasal swabs. Those swabs are then heated in a mixture and then a paper strip is dipped into that mixture, and if it shows the color, then that means you are COVID positive. It also has a very high level of sensitivity and specificity. So this is also a very good test, and its importance is also in the fact that apart from COVID-19, it can also be used for detecting other diseases as well, right? So let us see. Novel solution. CoviRAP machine resembles a box and comes with a kit. Kit has 3 master mixes, which are markers of different genes to confirm the virus. RNA samples are extracted from nasal swabs and mixed with master mixing tubes. So if you remember, in case of Feluda, we use either blood or saliva, and preferably we use saliva. The tubes are put in a machine which is set at a specific temperature and programmed to run for a fixed period. Once the heating is over, it's mixed with another solution and reheated. A paper strip is dipped into the reaction product. Colored lines develop, like in the pregnancy test, to indicate presence or absence of virus. And it also uses a smartphone app that can grab image of the strip and convey results. CoviRAP can deliver results in an hour. So what are the key differences with RT-PCR? RT-PCR, as we discussed yesterday, it is a very costly setup, at least 25 lakh rupees. Now this CoviRAP machine costs only rupees 5,000 rupees, and the test kit costs only about 500 rupees. The RT-PCR needs to be operated by a molecular biologist, but this CoviRAP can be operated with minimal training, and the main advantage is that it can be used in the field. You do not need to have a laboratory setup to use CoviRAP, right? Then Chinese soldier held in Ladakh sent back, nothing to discuss there. Now this is important news again. Air pollution now biggest health risk in India, says report. Long-term exposure contributed to over 1.67 million deaths in 2019. 1.16 lakh infants died in first months. Now this is the first time that a study has paid attention to infants, right? So let us look at this study and the results. Now this report is called State of Global Air 2020 or SOGA by the US based Health Effects Institute. Now what does it say? Long-term exposure to outdoor and household air pollution contributed to over 1.6 million annual deaths in India in 2019 from stroke, heart attack, diabetes, lung cancer, chronic lung diseases and neonatal diseases. And see, this problem could be excavated because already this pollution is making our lungs and our respiratory system very weak. So it will be a fertile ground for COVID virus to attack. So now there are concerns that the problem of COVID would be excavated because of pollution. More than half of these deaths were associated with outdoor PM 2.5. So PM 2.5, and if you remember in a video we discussed about particulate matter, which is even smaller than PM 2.5, and it was about 40 to 60% in Delhi air pollution. So it is even more dangerous than PM 2.5, and the effects of that particulate matter on your body is not completely understood as of yet. So this is a very complex problem. And others were linked to use of solid fuels, charcoal, wood, animal dung for cooking. Now danger to infants. Outdoor and household particulate matter pollution also contributed to the deaths of more than 1,16,000 Indian infants in the first month of life. This is the first time any study is focusing on the impact of pollution, especially the particulate matter on infants, right? For the youngest infants, most deaths were reported due to complications from low birth weights and preterm birth. Nearly 2/3 deaths are attributed to household air pollution from burning of biomass fuel. So this is again a very, very grave problem, and especially in the rural area. People would think that in rural areas pollution would be less. Okay, it could be, but the indoor pollution, the indoor air pollution, and it is a very, very serious problem. It is a problem in urban areas as it is, but it is also a very big problem in rural areas. And imagine the plight of those people who are living in urban areas, who are poor and who are still using biomass fuel for their requirements. So they are facing a double whammy, right? So these are very concerning figures. Again, a very dangerous point, highest per capita exposure. India faced the highest per capita pollution exposure, or 83.2 micrograms per cubic meter in the world, followed by Nepal and then Niger. And see the contrast. It is almost 10 times. Countries with least pollution exposure are below 8 micrograms, and in India 83.2. See, almost 10 times the difference. Increased risk with COVID. All the full links between air pollution and COVID-19 not yet known. Clear evidence linking air pollution and increased heart and lung disease, creating a growing concern that exposure to high levels of air pollution during winter months in South Asian countries and East Asian could worsen the effects of COVID-19. So please take care of yourself, stay indoors, do not put yourself in any dangerous situation, especially with the coming festive season, because new studies are coming out every day, and now they are saying that COVID-19 has long-term effect on people who have recovered. Their lung functions, their heart functions are being impaired. So please take care. Now directly to page 6 editorial. A crucial season. So this is again about the Prime Minister's warning that we should take care with the upcoming festive season, and there could be spikes in the infection rates if we do not take precautions. So this is all about that. Then potholes on digital payment superhighway. Now this is about NPCI. Now Mr. Burman, he has given some of his opinions. We are not interested in that. What we'll get to know from this one is the evolution of digital payments in India. Then we'll also get to know about NPCI and some of the products of NPCI that are being used. That is the only useful part from this one. So let us look at it. Now, history of evolution of digital payments in India. A major thrust towards large value payments was effected with RTGS, and it was launched in March 2004. Then around the same time, RBI also introduced NEFT and bulk debits and credits to support retail payments. Now, retail payments and digital payments are very, very important, more so in the COVID pandemic era, right? We discussed how globalization, if you remember the editorial by Mr. Shyam Saran, how globalization is taking a new shape. With the rise of digital payment, the world is again becoming increasingly connected, but that connection is digital, not physical, right? If you remember, now digital payments are here to stay. They will only get stronger. And then there are new ways coming. For example, you scan your card and no contact methods of payment. You scan your phone to pay, right? So these are all digital payments, but it needs to be secure and it needs to work well. So India is working exceptionally well in this field. Now, NEFT is available around the clock, that is 24/7, and RTGS will also follow from December 2020. Now, because of this digital payment network or architecture, the payments are happening very, very fast. So SEBI is also contemplating to shifting to a T+1 settlement. Now, what is T+1 settlement? For example, you buy shares, right? So it takes time to process that payment. For example, earlier when you used to transfer money from one account to another account, it would take some time. So that time or that movement from one account to another is called settlement. Now basically T+1, T+2 and T+3 systems are followed. T+3 means that if transaction has taken this day, then it would take at least 3 days for the money to get transferred. T+2 means that it would take at least 2 days, and T+1 means that it would take 1 day. That is, you make a transaction today and tomorrow you will be having access to money. For example, you are a seller, you sell your shares today, the buyers would get the demat shares and you would get the payment the very next day. Now, why is that happening? Because of the speed at which the transactions are happening because of this digital payment architecture. This is expected to attract more international capital in the Indian market in broadening and deepening the financial market. So this is leading to maturity of Indian financial market. So international capital would also be coming in because they would see that the payments are getting settled fast. So more capital is also expected because of this simple change from T+2 and T+3 to T+1 settlement. Now about NPCI, it is an umbrella system that serves as an umbrella body for the operation of retail payment in India. The idea of this umbrella retail payments institution emerged in the vision document on payment system released by RBI in 2005. Then it was set up by 10 lead banks at the instance of RBI in 2009. Now, what are the indicators of success of NPCI? NPCI's success against deeply entrenched formidable international players supported by innovative technology like UPI, that is the Unified Payment Interface that we all use these days, and the IMPS is well recognized by central banks in many countries. The Bank for International Settlements Endorsement, or the BIS Bank, you will get to know more about BIS when you study about the banking system, right? NPCI model in 2019 is a major accolade. If the NPCI has gained such a rare distinction in just 10 years of its successful and path-breaking journey, we should be proud to preserve this precious jewel. Now, what are the products of NPCI? RuPay. Now, what is RuPay? It is a domestic credit card which has magnetic stripe along with the EVM chip. So it has both a stripe and a chip, and it is now accepted at all ATMs and has been issued by 300 cooperative banks and regional rural banks. Then the National Common Mobility Card. It is also known as RuPay contactless card. It is a contactless payment technology which allows the card holders to use their card in contactless payment terminals without the need to physically swipe or insert card. Now this is very, very important in light of the pandemic, right? More and more contactless technologies and implementations are required. So this is a good thing. Then Bharat Interface for Money, or BHIM. It is a mobile payments application based on NPCI's Unified Payment Interface. It provides the facility to easily send or receive money from another customers using the UPI. Then at this point, what is UPI? Now UPI was introduced as an instant interbank payment system. This payment systems was developed to provide mobile platform for instant transfer of funds between two bank accounts, and this happens, right? And we have started using it more and more. And then finally the Bharat Bill System, which is an initiative taken by NPCI along with RBI for payments of all bills, which will provide an interoperable and accessible bill payment service to all its customers. So some part was from the editorial, and these products of the NPCI I added, right? So this is about this editorial, nothing more you need to know from that. In West Asia, its bleak future amid America fading. Now this editorial is about the waning American influence in the WANA region, West Asia, North Africa, and more specifically about West Asia. It gives examples of Syria and Iran, how Mr. Trump's policy has backfired. Now this editorial starts by telling that this Abraham Accord, this has been the rare success of Mr. Trump's foreign policy. Apart from that, his policy has failed spectacularly everywhere. For example, the US-Taliban deal, even as they are negotiating, they are also fighting with each other. North Korea, his attempt to bring North Korea on board, that has also failed. Then he was trying to put maximum pressure on Iran. Now Iran is pushing back, so it has also backfired. And he was talking about the deal of the century between Israelis and the Palestinians, and that has not happened. And US is also mired in a trade war and a geopolitical war with China. So he's saying that there's not much to boast about Mr. Trump's foreign policy. Now let us pay attention to the main region, that is West Asia, that this editorial is talking about. Now he starts by saying that it was evident during Obama years that US has overstretched itself in West Asia and North Africa, WANA, a region America has deeply engaged with since President Eisenhower's time. US has been stuck in an unwinnable war in Iraq. That is true. In Syria, it was checkmated by Russians. Intervention in Libya turned out to be disastrous. Iran continued to be defiant to the threats and sanctions, and Israel was uncontrollable. This was all happening. The Arab allies were upset. Mr. Obama realized historical necessity of resizing the US presence in the region and pivoting to East Asia, where China was steadily on the rise. And that is why Mr. Obama, he recalibrated the US foreign policy to the Indo-Pacific region. Today we'll also be discussing about Indo-Pacific in a very good editorial from the Indian Express. But US has both allies and rivals in the region and it cannot simply pack up and exit. Now, he's telling us about the Obama and Trump years. So Obama was basically aiming for a policy called cold peace. Obama, in his second term, adopted a realistic approach to address this problem. He made peace with Iran, accepted Russian lead role in Syria because they were checkmated there, left Libya burning. And I told you time and again that Americans, they do not lose wars, they just lose interest. So they lost interest in Libya, ignored Saudi and Israeli sulking over Iran because he reached out to Iran and there was a deal with Iran, but Mr. Trump backed out of it. But to balance these, he overlooked Israel's deepening occupation of Palestine and cooperated with Saudi attack on Yemen. The plan was to let the regional players establish what he called a cold peace, that they would be at peace, but still they would be fighting with each other. It would not be a true peace. It would be more like a Cold War situation. Now Trump came and he tried to undo whatever Obama achieved. He demolished the Iran deal, brought Israel back to the center of America's policy towards the region, and prompted Arab and Jewish allies of the US to join hands. The plan was to remake the regional dynamics in favor of America's allies and push rivals to the corner. So that is what he's trying to do. Bring America's Jewish and Arab allies like Israel, Saudi, Bahrain together and push rivals like Iran to the corner. But that has provided space for the rise of Turkey. Now Turkey is trying to be the leader of the Islamic world. He succeeded in bringing the Gulf Arab countries and Israel together, but he failed to escape the historical reality that America's dwindling influence in shaping the present and future of West Asia. So the case of Iran. So what happened in Iran? That Mr. Trump followed the maximum pressure policy. He tried to bully Iran, but that backfired. Iran responded with multiple cuts on US and allied interests in the region, targeting Saudi oil facilities and cargo ships in the Strait of Hormuz to launch rocket attacks at American troops in Iraq. Now, Strait of Hormuz is a very, very strategic place and Iran virtually owns that place and major shipping route goes through that. So basically what Iran did, it hit US and its allies where it hurts the most, that is the oil supplies. Then he had Qasem Soleimani, one of the top Irani generals, killed and declared that the US had re-established deterrence vis-a-vis Iran. But the use of force did not reflect the ground realities. Less than a year after the assassination of Soleimani, US faced with continuing rocket attacks by Iran-backed Shia rebels in Iraq, is contemplating shutting down the American embassy in Baghdad while withdrawing most troops from Iraq. So this has backfired. Open embrace of Israel. Mr. Trump brought together Gulf Arabs and Jews who had backroom contacts for years on a public platform. But he also opened the way for agitated Persians and ambitious Turks to enhance their weight in the troubled regional politics. We have discussed all of this, how joining of hands of the Gulf Arabs and Jews has left a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled by Turkey, right? Mr. Erdogan trying to be the leader of that region, right? So this is all about this editorial. Back to basics in algorithms. Now this is a critique of the new education policy when it comes to programming, because new education policy envisages programming from early schooling years. Now this has created a sort of controversy, and even if you look at outside government sector, there's this company Whitehead Jr. and it is running huge promotional campaigns about inducing children into taking coding classes. Now there has been a backlash over it on the social media because people say that children at such a young age, they should be playing, they should be learning other things than to stare at screens and learning coding, and there is a very, very big merit in that, and they are also making somewhat the same point, right? Their focus is on algorithms, that rather than focusing on coding from a very early age, they should focus on algorithm, because the back end of coding is an algorithm only. Once you are clear in algorithms, coding is just a method to ensure that you implement your algorithm. And coding languages can always change. There are so many languages, and who knows in future 10 years down the line which language is being used, right? So it is more important to develop the skills in algorithms than coding at an early age. Now they trace the evolution of algorithms from around the Mesolithic age, which is 10,000 to 8,000 BC. Then they tell us that the modern algorithms can be traced back to around 300 BCs, in some famous works, right? And there are Indian examples as well. Now, the notion of computation and algorithms are as old as mathematics and date back to the early stages of representing numbers and geometrical figures and manipulating them for various uses. Their origins can be traced back to almost the beginning of Mesolithic Stone Age, when the notions of counting and addition begin to take form. So Mesolithic Stone Age again is around 10,000 to 8,000 BC. All early learning of counting and arithmetic is method based and hence algorithm in nature, and all calculations involve computational processes encoded in algorithms. So this is a very important point. Now they say the modern algorithms, almost in the same form as we know them today, begin to appear around 300 BC. Some of the earliest examples are procedures to compute the greatest common divisor of a pair of numbers, or the factorial, which appears in the Euclid's Book of Elements. So this is important. Factorial, Euclid's Book of Elements, and the description of the fast exponential and the Fibonacci sequence, which appeared around 200 BC in the treatise of Chanda Sutra by Acharya Pingala. So Fibonacci sequence and exponential can be traced back to Chanda Sutra by Acharya Pingali around 200 BC. Very good examples. The core algorithmic ideas of modern AI and machine learning are based on some seminal algorithm ideas of Newton and Gauss, which date back to a few hundred years. Although the form of expression of algorithm, the coding, have been different, the fundamental principles of classical algorithm design have remained invariant. So this is as old as human civilization, and more importantly, as old as from the time we started expressing numbers in forms and manipulating them to get to desired ends. Now, in the modern world, the use of algorithm is not limited to computations with numbers or even to digitization, communication, or AI and data science. They have wide implications. For example, social media, all run by AI. Importance of AI is everywhere in every field in our life, from supply chain networks to transportation networks to commerce and banking. AI is being used everywhere, and algorithm is the backbone of AI. Hence, learning algorithm thinking early in education process is indeed crucial. Coding, however, is merely the act of encoding an algorithm method in a particular programming language, which provides an interface such that the computational process can be invoked in a modern digital computer. So that is what the importance of coding is. So coding can be learned later on as well. There is no need to teach coding. More important is to teach algorithms. And if any of you are computer science engineers or engineers, or if you are conversant with coding, whenever you make a new program, the first point is to come up with an algorithm, a process as to how you would get to the result, and then you would use the code. So algorithm is the backbone. Coding can be taught at any time. Thus, it is less fundamental, and indeed, great algorithms have been designed through the ages even without this facility. While coding certainly can provide excellent opportunities for experimentation with algorithm ideas, they are not central or indispensable to algorithmic thinking. After all, coding is merely one vehicle to achieve experiential learning of computational process. Very, very true. So learning the fundamentals. It is more important at an early stage of education to develop an understanding of the basic algorithm processes behind manipulating geometric figures, computing with numbers, solving systems of equations, modeling road networks and social graphs, and applying algorithmic ideas to everyday problems. In fact, an overemphasis on learning the nitty-gritty of specific programming languages prematurely, even from middle school, may distract from focusing on development of algorithmic creativity. So very, very true, because what happens in our country, unfortunately, rote learning is there, right? So without understanding anything, people would be rote learning. Same would happen with the programming thing. So it is more important that children should be taught how to use their creative energy to come up with different algorithms than to waste their time on coding languages, because languages can become outdated at any point of time, right? So this is what this editorial is saying. Good one. Make your notes about this. The manacles of caste in sanitation workers. So nothing much to discuss here. This is basically discussing about the plight of sanitation workers in India. That is the only important point there. So I have noted them down. You can read in the PDF. That is more than enough, right? Then page 10. In festive cheer, 30 lakh central government staff to get bonus. Plan is to put cash in employees' pockets, says Javadekar. Again, this bonus would be there to spur market demand. Now, when there would be market demand, if there is liquidity in the hand of consumers, so they would be buying. When they would be buying, there would be some activity in the market, right? They would lead to some increase in demand, and that would lead to revival of the economy. Now, this is just for central staff, but this puts pressure on state governments as well to give bonus to their employees, as well as the private sector. So that is why they are giving this bonus to the employees. Then J&K District Council poll soon. We have already discussed that DDCs would be formulated, right? And there would be elections. Every DDC, the DDC would be basically the third tier above the village and block level panchayat. Then there would be DDC. In a district, every area would come under DDC except for municipal corporation and a municipality, right? We have already discussed, and every district would be divided into 14 electoral constituencies, and members of DDCs would be directly elected. So let us look at it again. So the Union Cabinet approved the adoption of Jammu and Kashmir Panchayati Raj Act 1989, notified by Union Home Ministry on October 17. The amendment paves way for the creation of DDC, or the District Development Councils, whose members will be directly elected by the people. The DDCs will have jurisdiction over the entire district, excluding municipalities or municipal corporations. DDC will be the third tier at district level over the block and village levels. Every district will be divided into 14 territorial constituencies to elect members of the body. DDC shall consist of directly elected members from territorial constituencies, these 14, then members of legislative assemblies representing a part or whole of the district whose constituencies lie within the district, and the chairperson of all block development councils of the district. So the directly elected persons, then MLAs, and the chairperson of block development councils of the district. All DDC members, whether or not elected by direct elections from the territorial constituencies, shall have the right to vote in meeting. So when it comes to meeting, they will have the right to vote. But when it comes to election or removal of chairman and vice chairman, then MLAs will not have the right, and only the directly elected members, that is from the 14 territorial constituencies, they will have the right to vote in the elections or removal of the chairperson and vice chairman. Group of senators back Australia's inclusion. So, bipartisan group of senators from both the Republican and the Democratic parties have written a letter to the Indian ambassador in the US, and they have hailed the decision of Australia's inclusion in the Malabar exercise, and they have also asked India to join the Blue Dot Network initiative. So we'll just look at it. A bipartisan group of senators has written a letter to India's ambassador to the US backing India's decision to invite Australia to the annual Malabar naval exercise. Ask India to join Blue Dot Network. So now what is Blue Dot Network? It is a US-led collaboration with Australia and Japan to support private sector-led infrastructure financing opportunities in response to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and we have already discussed this in an earlier video. So basically under Blue Dot Network, they will be providing finance facilities for projects. Only finance facilities, and these are the pillars that this would be open and inclusive, it would be transparent and accountable, it will be financially sustainable, it would be socially and environmentally responsible, and it would be market driven. So it would be everything that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is not. That is the whole purpose of this Blue Dot Network. So this is about it. Then Informatic Management, a serious challenge. So Soumya Swaminathan, chief scientist at WHO, she said that apart from fighting the COVID, they are also fighting infodemic and how to manage it. So let us see how they are managing it, and let us also look at what is infodemic. So managing the infodemic has been a serious challenge during the COVID-19 pandemic, said Soumya Swaminathan, chief scientist at WHO, defining infodemic as having too much information, including false or misleading information, particularly on social media. And let me tell you, the main culprits are WhatsApp University and Facebook University. She said that it led to confusion, risk-taking, and ultimately mistrust towards governments and the public health response. Now, how is WHO addressing it? It has been working with technology companies to address this challenge by directing public to credible sources of information, taking down false and misleading information from online platforms, developing chatbots in different languages so that public could use them for accessing information. But she says that tackling this is not easy because this is also about people's beliefs and behavior. Case in point, there are so many people in our country, not just our country, entire world, who have this thinking that if it's on WhatsApp or if it's on Facebook or if it's on internet, it must be true without basically looking for the source and the legitimacy of any news that they read. So there is no credibility, and that is why fake news have exploded, right? So this is what is known as infodemic. Then integrated command's next step in reforms. So the army chief, he made a statement that in future integrated command means that all the three arms of our armed forces, the army, navy and the air force, they would be working together. There would be greater synergy in action between them. That would lead to a leaner but a more efficient armed force, right? So he's saying that that is the natural next step of reforms in the armed forces, though it will take some years, but that is going to happen. Then world, page 13, Pompeo esper to travel to India for 2+2 dialogue. So we have already discussed what is 2+2 dialogue. The defense and finance ministers of both the countries would be meeting, and they're basically coming to finalize the BECA agreement. We have discussed BECA yesterday and day before yesterday. Now in a new documentary, Pope endorses same-sex civil unions. So in a feature-length documentary, Pope Francis endorsed same-sex civil unions for the first time as Pope. Or he has been endorsing that, but not so much publicly. So he said the homosexual people have the right to be in a family. They are children of God. Pope Francis said in one of his sit-down interviews for the film, what we have to have is a civil union law. That way they are legally covered. Now serving as an Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Pope endorsed civil unions for gay couples as an alternative to same-sex marriages. So the Vatican is backing same-sex unions. Then government to widen manufacturing PLI plan. So we have discussed what is PLI plan. Now this was for mobile companies, mobile and electronics manufacturers, right? Component manufacturers, and major players like Foxconn have got the bids. Government cleared 16 companies. So Foxconn, Samsung, other companies have joined it, right? And there's a huge potential of this scheme. So now government is going to expand it to other sectors as well. The production linked incentive scheme for manufacturing investments will soon be extended to 8 more sectors. The scheme will give cash incentives for 5 to 7 years, and all the sunrise and important sectors are proposed to be covered in this. Now what is the sunrise industry? This is a burgeoning sector or business in its infancy stage, showing promise of a rapid boom. They are typically characterized by high growth rates, numerous startups and an abundance of venture capital funding. So these are sunrise industries, and they are also the focus of government under the PLI scheme. The scheme is very important, and it is showing positive response from industry. So government is going to expand it to other players as well. Now starting with the Indian Express, front page, monetization of idle land, railways, defense, BSNL in line. These key ministries and departments, they have huge caches of unused land or idle land. So government is trying to sell them off and to earn some revenue in the process. So monetization of land assets is aimed at shoring up government finances through non-tax revenues and generating funds for infrastructure initiatives. So whatever the money would come from this sale would be invested in infrastructure initiatives. Again, why infrastructure initiatives? I have told you time and again, because it leads to increase in the overall capacity of the economy. It leads to creation of jobs. It leads to increase in demand in the core sector, which are the important indices for any economy. So that is why we invest in infrastructure initiatives. The expansion of the program is expected to boost economic activity amid COVID slump. So the center is at advanced stage of monetizing idle land assets of key ministries and departments, including railway, telecommunication, defense, and plans to use the resources generated to create infrastructure assets across the country. After a detailed assessment of surplus land assets, various ministries are now ready to go ahead with monetization of idle parcels for commercial development and infrastructure creation. So this is all about it. Then cabinet clears decks for district councils in J&K. We have already discussed. Now page 9, air pollution had role in over 116,000 infant deaths in India in 2019. We have discussed already. This is the first ever comprehensive analysis of air pollution's global impact on newborns, and is the first time deaths in infants aged under 1 month have been estimated. So this is the important point, very crucial. The findings are based on the recent Global Burden of Diseases study published recently by the Lancet. Nearly 21% of neonatal deaths from all causes are attributable to ambient and household air pollution. The report also highlights the ongoing challenge of high outdoor air pollution. South Asian countries, including India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal, feature amongst the top 10 countries with highest index of PM 2.5 exposure. We have already discussed that India has almost 10 times the exposure of low exposure countries, right? Among the various air pollutants, ambient PM 2.5 has been shown to cause the greatest number of deaths. India tops the world for the highest population weighted annual average PM 2.5 levels, right? We've already discussed. Now, again, an important point. India ranks number 3 in world for annual ozone exposures after Qatar and Nepal. And India continues to show the highest increase in ozone levels among the countries compared to previous years. According to the report, ozone is a harmful gas that affects the respiratory tract and not only causes worsening of asthma and respiratory tract infections, but also contributes significantly to global warming. And ozone exposure to ozone also leads to problems like skin cancer, right? So ozone is very, very dangerous, and India is getting exposed more so in the metropolitan cities. Ground level ozone is very high because of pollution problem, temperature inversions, the unique conditions. So this is a very big dangerous sign, and our country needs to do something very substantial about dealing with the pollution problem. Then this editorial, good editorial, The Rise of Quad. This is by Mr. Sujan R. Chinoy, and he is a former diplomat, former ambassador of India. So let us see what he's written. First of all, he talks about the concept of Indo-Pacific as against the concept of Asia-Pacific. So let us see what he's saying. Indo-Pacific concept has gained fresh currency, should not come as a surprise. It is an inclusive and representative term that reflects the contemporary interconnectedness of trade, technology, and supply chains in a wider region. By comparison, Asia-Pacific represented the trans-Pacific strategic and economic impulses after World War II and was confined to East and Southeast Asia. So Indo-Pacific comprising of Indian and Pacific Oceans, right? But this Asia-Pacific was limited to this Southeast Asia and East Asia, basically the East Pacific and the Pacific region, right? So it was more about the Pacific, but Indo-Pacific is a larger area, right? Moreover, the Indo-Pacific is being redefined ironically by China's Belt and Road Initiative, debt-trapped diplomacy, fictional territorial claims, because I've told you, whenever they want to claim something, they say historical maps. Historically, we've been ruling the whole world. Crazy people. And divide and rule strategy. The historical experience of Indo-Pacific strategies of the colonial age can help provide deeper insight into the malefic impact of China's neo-colonialism. Beijing views the Indo-Pacific as a direct threat to BRI and in a classical Vachi calculation as an encirclement strategy. Now what is Vachi? It is the game of surrounding, has long been popular in the East, known as Go in Japan and Baduk in Korea. It is a board game and you surround your adversary. So Beijing thinks of Indo-Pacific as a Vachi strategy to contain Beijing. Now how would Beijing be reacting? One can expect China to use Vachi principles and Guangxi networks and connections to weaken the Quad, especially in Japan and Australia. So how to deal with the adversaries? You make networks and connections and you basically pit your adversaries against each other. That is what China is going to do, and whatever China is doing these days, their actions seem to be stemming from the ancient Chinese strategies and the games that they used to play. The economies of these two key Quad members remain heavily dependent on China. Japan's efforts at economic decoupling from Australia's endeavors to subject Chinese investment and influence peddling to greater scrutiny should be lauded. So they are working in this field to basically decouple their economies from the Chinese regime. So what Japan is doing, Japan is basically giving incentives to its companies to shift out of China, and Australia is also telling its companies to shift out of China, and China and Australia have been engaged in very ugly diplomatic spats recently. Now, Japan's recent enabling agreements with Vietnam and Philippines for defense exports could lead to similar agreements with Indonesia and Thailand. Hopefully, the Scott Morrison government in Australia will continue to receive full domestic support for its increasingly robust China policy. Now, the role of India, how India is sort of taking a leadership role. Once a solitary voice, India's concerns about the BRI are now echoed by several countries. India took the lead in banning Chinese apps. Notably, it was India's decision that had elevated the Quad dialogue to ministerial level in 2019. Yet again, it is India which has shed its reticence and decided to welcome Australia to the Malabar exercise. India's pullout from the RCEP negotiations last year may have appeared self injurious then, but subsequent developments have put into sharper relief of the deleterious role of China centric supply chains. China's actions have since led to, now this is important, Resilient Supply Chain Initiative RSCI involving India, Japan, Australia, focused on key sectors. What are those sectors? Semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, automobiles, and telecommunications. See, these are all the sectors where China is dominating. So to cut off China, they're trying to make their or diversify their global supply chain so that if a next problem comes, then all of countries are not dependent on China. And see what is happening. Even though the Chinese figures are totally fussed, but they are putting up the appearance that their economy is doing better while rest of the world is suffering. And why? Because of the mistakes of China. The virus came from Wuhan, China. They never told the world. Now they are making progress and we are all paying the price, right? I told you yesterday as well how China has added 257 new billionaires in this year only. So this is what is happening. An ambitious China has consistently sought the expulsion of US from its periphery, right? But it says that US has played a key role in region's stability and prosperity following the Second World War. The examples being US military presence prevented Japan from rearming itself. Very true. It cautioned China against risking military adventurism across Taiwan Strait that would have otherwise derailed its economic ascendance and kept the peace on the Korean peninsula for over 6 decades. So this is the importance of America in the region. And China is basically preparing itself for an invasion into Taiwan. It has positioned its troops and its missiles, hypersonic missiles are all targeting Taiwan. And there was a piece in its official mouthpiece, the Global Times, which said that forced integration of Taiwan would happen next year. So we are going to see that. Now the question is, would the world watch or would it do something to check Chinese aggression? Now in the South China Sea, we've discussed so many times, China's preposterous claims, island building spree and militarization of oceanic space continue to grab headlines. China is member of UNCLOS yet disregards its precepts. If you remember, I told you about the 2012 judgment of The Hague when it favored the Philippines, but China flatly refused, and since then China has been very, very aggressive in this region. Vastly adept at concocting historical evidence to buttress claims, China has regularly used Visha. Again, we all know China is a country of liars, official liars. They make propaganda videos and they lie about everything to suit themselves. And this is the problem because their economy is not doing well and that is an authoritarian regime. So they would be picking up fights to basically divert the national attention from the national problems to international fora. That is what the plan of Mr. Xi is. So again, Visha policy, strategy to fracture ASEAN consensus. As the only major power involved in the code of conduct negotiations, China will probe chinks in the armor of ASEAN centrality to exploit and shape outcomes, because 5 of the members of ASEAN are also involved in the South China Sea dispute. So China would try to pit one member against the other and break the consensus of ASEAN, for which it is famous. The US position on South China Sea is now fully in alignment with the Permanent Court of Arbitration Arbitral Award in 2016. While it cannot restore the status quo ante in the South China Sea, it does boost the morale of disputants such as Philippines. If you remember, we discussed how Philippines is going to resume oil and gas exploration in the Reed Reef. I showed you on map as well, right? Now in the Indian Ocean, China uses the cloak of anti-piracy deployments to maintain a quasi-permanent presence with bases in Gwadar and Djibouti as beachheads for penetrating South Asia, Gulf region and littoral Africa. As was once the case in dealing with the Yungu barbarians on its northern borderlands, China continues to employ ancient stratagems to pit one nation against another on its periphery to weaken and subjugate contending forces through guile and inducement. So this is the Chinese plan. Now Mr. Chinoy tells what needs to be done, because as of now Quad has not said anything strong. It is only saying that free and open Indo-Pacific. So he says that it now needs a definitive blueprint in order to have a meaningful impact. It should have a tough security-oriented core with a softer and inclusive exoskeleton that prioritizes the development agenda. The Quad Plus format should cater to the regional economic needs, including infrastructure, connectivity and capacity building. So very good article. Now page 12, integration of armed forces is inevitable, says Army Chief. So I've already told you, General Navarne said the next logical step in the process of defense reforms was the formation of integrated theatre commands to synergize the capabilities and combat potential of the three services during war and peace, and advised that this process will be deliberate, thoughtful and well considered, and its fruition will take a number of years. He called it an inevitability as it would lead to tri-services synergy and optimization of resources. So a lean but mean defense force we'll have in future. Indigenous stealth ship to be commissioned today. So INS Kavaratti, an indigenously built anti-submarine warfare stealth corvette, is set to be commissioned into the Indian Navy. The ship will be commissioned into the Navy as combat-ready platform as the ship has completed sea trials. INS Kavaratti has been designed by the Navy's in-house organization D&D, Directorate of Naval Design, and built by GRSE. So, see, mostly all the ships in India would be built by GRSE, especially these stealth frigates and corvettes. The corvette has state-of-the-art weapons and sensor suite capable of detecting and prospecting submarines. In addition to its anti-submarine warfare capabilities, the ship also has credible self-defense capability and good endurance for long-range deployments. Now, again important because there is a topic like indigenization of defense or indigenization of technology. So this is important for your paper 3 GS. The ship has up to 90% of indigenous content, and the use of carbon composites for the superstructure is commendable feat achieved in Indian shipbuilding. So it uses carbon composites for superstructure, that is the body. The ship's weapons and sensor suite is predominantly indigenous and showcases nation's growing capability in this niche area according to the Navy. Kavaratti takes its name from the erstwhile INS Kavaratti, which was an Arna-class missile corvette. The older Kavaratti distinguished itself by operating in support of Bangladesh's liberation of 1971. Page number 15 explained. Yesterday we discussed US sues Google, what it means. So let us see. We'll just quickly go through it. Now what the lawsuit said, that the main concerns are business practices that may have led to massive concentrations of economic power in a few companies such as Google. I've told you everything. The congressional committee, the bipartisan committee, they inquired into conduct of 4 companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook and Apple, and they found many anti-competitive practices. So they are starting with Google. Probably they'll be opening more cases against other companies, and Google is also facing anti-competitive lawsuits in India, 4 already, and 1 more probably going to happen because of the Android TV thing. And in India, the anti-competition body is Competition Commission of India. So we've discussed this, that is why I'm just rushing through it. The lawsuit will focus on Google as it is the gateway to the internet and search advertising behemoth. It has maintained its monopoly power through exclusionary practices that harm competition. So what it does, it basically buys out the competition, or it forces the suppliers or customers to not to use the services of the competition. Earlier this month, a US House of Representatives panel submitted the report of a bipartisan investigation into working of Amazon, Apple, Google and Facebook. Probe started in July 2019. These companies have been on the radar of governments in many countries for being big spenders and trying to steamroll competition by either buying out their rivals or pushing vendors to avoid working with these rivals. I've told you all of these things, how they buy out startups, right? So the committee said that these big companies should be broken into smaller parts, and mergers, acquisitions and buyouts of startups should be checked. The panel said that each of these companies was now acting as a gatekeeper over a key channel of distribution, which meant that they had full control over what went on in their respective domains. So they are having a very pivotal position. The report called for the big technologies companies to be broken up for a presumptive prohibition against future mergers and acquisitions by the dominant platform. Why is the lawsuit important? It marks the first time there has been a bipartisan effort to look into the monopoly power of Google. The challenge for Google would be continued scrutiny into its biggest revenue generating stream, that is the search engine advertising. It earned nearly 38 billion in April-June quarter through only advertisements. Apart from increased federal scrutiny, big tech companies are also likely to face more questions and probes from states in the US, which have hauled these firms for not doing more to control their influence on day-to-day aspects of life. The last time Google faced legal action for allegedly abusing its dominance was in 2011, but that case was not pursued. Now, what are the allegations that Google faces in India? Important, over the last 3 years, Google has had multiple run-ins with the Competition Commission of India for alleged abuse of its dominant position in search engine market, Android smartphone and television market, the smart TV market, as well as Google Flight Services. Now let us see what it does. In 2019, India's antitrust body held Google guilty of misuse of its dominant position in the mobile Android market and said the company had imposed unfair conditions on device manufacturers to prevent themselves from using other operating systems. If you remember, I have discussed everything with you in the past. And in February 2018, the CCI had fined Google rupees 136 crore for unfair business practices in the online search market. It said that Google had allocated disproportionate real estate for its affiliates. For example, I want to search for a smartphone. I click in the search box smartphone or best smartphone. So among the top 2 or 3 choices, I will see the Google Pixel because the company is Alphabet and Google is a part of it. So that is what they do. Every company which is an affiliate of Google, they promote it. Same happens on Amazon. The ratings, most of the time those ratings are fake. And if you want to buy any product, there is a category called Amazon Basics. Those products would be having very high ratings in the rating category in Amazon. You can go and check. So allocated disproportionate real estate for its affiliates to the disadvantage of other companies that were trying to gain market access. It also found that Google has further provided a link in such commercial units which leads users to use its specialized search result page. For example, Google Flight. So it will show you those flights that have paid more to Google to get their results rather than the cheapest or the best option, resulting into unfair imposition upon the user's general search services as well. Google has challenged the CCI findings in forums such as the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal and the Supreme Court. Now, what could the US Justice Department action mean for Google? So there would not be anything monumental happening immediately, but this will start a dialogue. Although the lawsuit is the first of its kind, it is unlikely that there will be any swift action on the company in the near term, experts said. Google may argue before the courts that it is being singled out from amongst the other companies or try to explain why it does not really abuse its dominance in the market. Then quick COVID test from IIT Kharagpur, how it works and why it matters. We have already discussed it in the Hindu, so nothing new, just this part, COVID and Feluda. You can read it yourself. Important or interesting thing is Feluda is named after Satyajit Ray's fictional detective as an acronym for FN CAS9 Editor Limited Uniform Detection Essay. We have discussed Feluda yesterday as well, right? So only important point here, Satyajit Ray's fictional detective. Recalling a Pak misadventure, what happened on October 22nd, 1947. So if you remember a day before yesterday or yesterday, I told you about a news that Ministry of Culture is going to spearhead the new campaign that they will celebrate or they will tell the nation about what really happened on October 22nd, 1947, because fake narratives and distorted historical narratives have been run by anti-national elements and foreign elements about the circumstances under which J&K joined the Indian Union, right? So this is about that October 22nd thing only, right? So I'll just give you a quick overview because this is a historical lesson. It would be better that if you read it, I'll just give you the major points. So first he tells us that October 27 is celebrated as Black Day. So to counter that, Ministry of Culture is marking October 22, the day Pakistani invasion began and set the stage for First India-Pakistan War, by a strings of events including symposium in Srinagar on the events of that day. So this is basically a public outreach and telling people what really happened. So by October 1947, Kashmir was in high ferment. Why? Because Hindu-Muslim riots were happening and many Hindus were coming to India and Muslims going to Pakistan, and then there was a huge churning. So Mr. Hari Singh was facing a rebellion in Poonch by Muslim subjects and they had launched an armed insurgency, so he was facing his own problem. Now the thing was that Hari Singh was a Hindu ruler and the population of Kashmir was predominantly Muslim, right? But he did not join either India or Pakistan at independence. He wanted to remain independent. He was playing his own game. So what happened that he made an offer to both India and Pakistan for a standstill agreement. India did not sign. Pakistan took charge. And then Pakistan provided supplies and post and telegraphs to Kashmir, and that was happening through West Punjab. But then the riots increased and the problems increased, so the supply lines dried up. There was also problems in banking. The banking got disrupted. So what Pakistan did, it sent its armed rebels or tribals along with army men to infiltrate India and to take Kashmir by force. So on October 22nd, thousands of tribal invaders crossed into Kashmir, overrunning outposts of Hari Singh's state forces. And what happened? That the Kashmir forces were in small number, and also even from that force, the Muslim soldiers, they joined the invaders. Now the plan was tactfully sound. This is what the Ministry of Defense tells us. That plan was tactfully sound, and they had planned this whole thing at least 2 months in advance. And that has been corroborated by a book by Major General Akbar Khan of the Pakistan Army in his book Raiders of Kashmir. One of the most significant episodes was attack on Baramulla on the night of October 26-27 and targeting of St. Joseph's Convent and Hospital. Now various accounts are there of the invasion. These Pashtun tribesmen, they came to form an advance party of Pakistani military. Now this is one of the theories that Pakistan pushed them here because they were also trying to ask for a new Pashtun land in Pakistan. So to diverge their interests, they pushed them towards Kashmir. But these Pashtuns, when they came here, they were more interested in looting and arson than occupying territory. And many of them, they looted and they went back. They looted, killed, raped, did whatnot, and many went back. Now, in all this process, 2 Kashmiris are celebrated. Number 1 is Brigadier Rajinder Singh. He was appointed as the new Chief of Staff of the state forces, and he blew up a bridge in Uri, which slowed the advance of tribesmen. And the other is Shahid Maqbool Sherwani. He was a national conference worker in Baramulla, so he gave the invaders wrong directions to Srinagar airport. And when they found out that he tricked them, they killed him and hanged him publicly, right? Now what happened after the raid? Because they were within a very short distance of Srinagar, so Mr. Hari Singh, he went running to Mr. Patel, and then he signed the standstill agreement and instrument of accession. And under that, India sent its forces on October 27. Then there was a battle. It stretched for a year, and finally ceasefire was declared on December 31, 1948. And then we got the whole LOC problem and the whole India, Pakistan in the UN. Now that is another topic of controversy, whether India should have gone to UN and what the leadership should have done. That is something that you should form your own opinion about. So this is what this is telling. This is important, and this is a very good initiative by the Ministry of Culture and Government of India to tell the true story about the events of October 22nd, 1947. Then, seeking solar system secret, NASA spacecraft briefly lands on asteroid. So such news are important for your prelims. So I'll just tell you some part and other you can read. So NASA spacecraft is called OSIRIS-REx, and its robot, it basically landed and it collected samples from the asteroid Bennu. Now they cannot confirm the success because it will take a day or two for them to process how much material that this robot collected. Then they'll tell us. So that is all about it. Then this also tells us about the Bennu, the asteroid. It has some unique composition. And why do we want to study asteroids? Because these are the asteroids that brought the life bearing elements onto Earth at different points within the geological history of Earth. So that is why we are interested in studying the asteroids. And OSIRIS-REx is basically named after the Egyptian god of death, Osiris. He is connected to death and also regeneration, right? Egyptian god of underworld. Rest you can read about this, right? So folks, that is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. Also press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos, and please give us a thumbs up if you liked our videos. Also connect with us on our Instagram page UPSC for everyone, and please connect with us on our Telegram page where you can access the PDFs of the videos that I'll be posting daily, right? So see you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.